I would like to say welcome to all the participants of this webinar. And thank you all for tuning into this week's CSOX webinar. I am Mehmet, Karli. I'm the coordinator of the program on contemporary Turkey at CSOX. Today, we are together to explore Turkey's disinformation ecosystem. The role that digital media plays in our democracies is at the top of agenda in almost all countries. The approaching American elections has brought the issue to the discussion table even more vividly. We all know that the technologies that we once hoped would further the dissemination of information and free exchange of views have also are being used for spreading disinformation and actually at times suppressing participation. Post-truth society, weaponization of social media, disinformation warfare are all terms that have entered into even our kitchen table conversations. While there's an increasing amount of literature examining this particular phenomenon in the context of the US and Europe, there's no doubt that there's a need to broaden the scope of this analysis. And we believe for this particular issue, Turkey is a very important case study. Internet penetration and social media usage are both relatively high in Turkey, and despite serious government oppression, Turkey is still one of the countries where there is a very active political conversation online. Most political developments in the country are highly digitally mediated. Yet, as we will discuss today, there is also a great deal of disinformation or vulnerability to disinformation. And that disinformation is being spread through those digital means. This contributes to further polarization of the society and creates an environment where followers of different political views cannot agree even on the most basic of facts. What is the scope of this problem? How it could be dealt with within the context of Turkey are the main focuses of today's webinar. Today's discussion, as you may have seen just in our presentation, will actually focus on the findings of a research project on Turkey's digital information ecosystem carried out by EDAM, Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, and the research project was funded by the US-based CREST Foundation. EDAM has spotted the lack of research on this issue in Turkey and filled that gap with a series of high-quality reports. And therefore, today's conversation will be mostly based on the findings of those reports. But that's the reason why I should first and foremost like to thank the director of the EDAM, Sinan Ülgen, who is also with us. I mean, he's one of the participants, for giving us the opportunity to organize this event together. We are so thankful to EDAM and to Sinan Ülgen for giving us this opportunity. And of course, to analyze this issue, we've got three great speakers today. We are very lucky to have three great speakers. Two of them are the authors of the reports that I've mentioned to you. We've got Afşin Yurdakul, Akın Ünver, and Ezgi Basaran. Ezgi will be the discussant for the purposes of today's conversation. Without further ado, I will first yield the floor to Akın, who will just speak for 15 minutes, then we will continue with Afşin, and then we will end with Ezgi, who will be discussing the findings of the report. Before I turn the floor to Akın, just a few logistical announcements. First, if you got any questions to our speakers, we would very much like you to type it up into the Q&A window of the Zoom screen that you got in front of you. You will see that small Q&A button there. If you click on it, another window will pop up, usually on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can type up your questions there. And we will try to collect all those questions, and I will try to ask all of them, address all of them to our speakers. Please do not use the chat button, the chat section. The chat section will be used by the administrator of CSOX, by Julie, and Julie will post the detailed bios of our speakers into this chat section. And I believe that's all in terms of the logistical announcements. And Without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to Akın. Akın, before I give the floor, I should say just a few words about Akın. He's one of the leading political scientists in Turkey. He's an assistant professor at the Kadir University, but he's no foreigner to Oxford. Back in the past, he was affiliated with the Oxford Internet Institute. Now he is affiliated with the Center for Technology and Global Studies at Oxford again. He's a board member at EDAM. He has been working for quite some time for mass surveillance and surveillance technologies in developed and developing countries, and how citizens come up with different strategies to overcome such governmental policies. Therefore, we are in the right hands with Akın. As I told you, he's the author of one of the reports. Akın, you got the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, CSOX, and thank you to Ezgi and Mehmet for hosting us. And also, I'm affiliated with EDAM, of course, but I also want to thank EDAM because basically focusing on the issue of disinformation and information manipulation in polarized societies is very, very important. And although everyone thinks that this is important, nobody actually spends focused amount of time to do actual empirical studies on how disinformation materializes and spreads out. And I also want to, EDAM wants to thank to Crest Foundation for funding this study, because it's both very difficult and also tricky to get funding for to do a study on disinformation in Turkey. So with all of those thanks mentioned, I'd like to go straight up into our report. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on essentially two reports that we prepared for EDAM. One was the Russian disinformation ecosystem in Turkey, the first report. And the second one is the practice of fact-checking and the fact-checkers as social institutions in Turkey. And effectively, the first report, the Russian disinformation system in Turkey, demonstrated to us that much like we recently have found in the United States, that Russian disinformation is problematic, but only problematic that is secondary to domestic disinformation that is produced in the United States. And the same goes for Turkey. Domestic disinformation ecosystem in Turkey is substantially much more problematic compared to, low level or under the radar behavior of Russia that we observe in Turkey. And back then, we had discovered that disinformation has been so overwhelming in Turkey that it's not really an anomaly. It has become the norm of political communication. Disinformation has become the primary source of political communication in Turkey. It's basically not through accurate facts, but basically you communicate politically based on how much you're able to mislead the other side, or basically mislead your own supporters if that's what you're trying to do. So after discovering that, I would say, significant finding, we basically explored several questions. So yes, disinformation ecosystem is problematic in Turkey. And disinformation is so rampant that it's, after a certain point, it's pointless to actually measure how much disinformation exists, because the overwhelming majority of political communication is disinformation from all sides, basically. So then the second natural question is, how do we fix that? So if we have diagnosed a very significant problem in Turkey, which is disinformation, and if everyone's doing it, and if it's so problematic that nobody even bothers to actually fix it, then who's going to fix it? News agencies, media corporations, government, state agencies. So essentially, we wanted to go in the direction of independent social institutions, and the only social institution that we can reasonably expect to solve this are fact-checking organizations, because media is highly polarized. The media ecosystem in Turkey isn't really interested about fact-checking, and it's strange because fact-checking as a practice evolved in the editorial office. Traditionally speaking, fact-checking is what the editorial office does in a TV or newspapers. But there are various reasons why it's not working in the modern information ecosystem. In Turkey, there's censorship, but in the United States, there are tons of other reasons why editorial offices can no longer practice fact-checking as good as they used to. One reason is that news has become too fast for traditional editorial offices. It's the digital news ecosystem is just like so large and so rapid that traditional centralized editorial mechanisms no longer are able to basically go and fact-check every single crazy claim somebody makes, in public discussion. So essentially, starting with the United States, we see this proliferation of fact checkers across the world. And Turkey is one of the first places that actually adopt this social institution, the emergence of fact checkers. In the United States, it starts with 2006, 2007. In Turkey, just only 3 years later, we have the emergence of, the first fact checker. And let me share my screen and give you some cool graphs from our report. Our report is basically available for everyone on EDAM website. So here, what we basically see is a breakdown of 8 of the most influential fact checker groups that can legitimately be called an important or relevant fact checking, because there are smaller fact checking groups as well. But they, either their follower base is too low that they don't really do that much of an impact, or they pop up, disappear, change names, so it's very confusing. So essentially, we have 3 major waves in Turkey in terms of the emergence of fact checkers. The first wave is essentially the swine flu of 2008, 2009. And it's quite similar to today's, COVID ecosystem, that so many people get frustrated with the lack of, proper medical information in mainstream media, that we have the emergence of Yalan Savar and Malumat Furuş as 2 medical / public health related, debunking institutions. The second wave comes with the political instability period in Turkey, beginning with 2014. We have the emergence of Doğruluk Payı, Teyit.org. And we have a third wave of fact checkers, which would be called the pro-government fact-checking network, when the government realizes that there's a lot of appeal and popularity towards fact checkers because the mainstream information and media ecosystem is basically so corrupted, that the government basically creates its own set of political fact checkers. And these are less of a fact checker than a public relation campaign outlets, basically. But what they do is they, yes, fact check, but they fact check very carefully selected, debunked stories that always basically supports the position of the government. So the third wave is the emergence of the pro-government fact-checking network in a way. So practically, what do those fact checkers do, and do they work or do they not? So there are several ways that we can basically understand and interpret whether fact checkers work or not. One is to actually go ask people, do survey. And we basically did a nationwide survey in Turkey, which was done also within the confines of EDAM. So does fact-checking work in Turkey? Right now, the main answer is no. The main reason why fact-checking doesn't work in Turkey is that, as you would see, actually, can I share a cursor? Maybe later, but you would see that at the center of the screen, we have, which outlet or platform do you use to verify news claims you see on the internet? The majority of Turks don't actually use the internet for news. So that's why even the concept of fact checking is very alien for the majority of them. And the third most popular option is that they don't fact check claims. Whenever they see a news online, they really don't fact check. And the second most popular group is actually fact checking other websites. But you really see a generational gap here. Younger people fact check more, and older people actually don't fact check at all. Basically, the majority of as you go more senior in the age pyramid, people start either not using the internet for news or basically not having this practice of fact checking. And in terms of educational attainment, definitely, as you basically progress further in the educational attainment statistic, we basically have more tendency to fact check. Lower educational attainment means less tendency to fact check. And there are interesting dynamics that I don't want to get into detail due to time constraints, but there are interesting party dynamics in terms of people's tendency to fact check. Basically, the group that least fact checks is the Cumhur Alliance, which is basically a combination of the AKP and MHP. But then again, Millet Alliance, which is the opposition alliance, they also really don't fact check. So if you're a member of an alliance, you don't really fact check. But if you mention a specific party affiliation, we basically have a fact-checking dynamic. And the most interesting is that independent candidate voters fact-check the most, which tells you a lot about, I think, the political trends in Turkey. As far as popularity, sorry, not popularity, this is what? Yeah, fact-checkers output based on aggregate number of fact-checking content pages on their website. So this is not a good measure, but it gives you basically an output of like how busy those fact checkers are. Teyit.org is quite the most busiest fact checking group in Turkey, followed by Doğruluk Payı, Doğruluğa Malumat Furuş. But that doesn't mean that it's not an important venue. For example, Evrim Ağacı, which is one of the most popular fact checking sites in Turkey, it appears that they have a low number of websites, but each web page they have has a very long, text written to that. So this is basically, a bad measure of output. The second thing that we can do in order to assess whether fact-checking works or not is basically, so this is a graph from Teyit.org's own impact research. They basically wanted to see whether, whether their fact checking is actually shared or whether it doesn't check. And it's a beautiful graph that basically shows you every single news item that they have fact checked. The plus side basically shows you how much digital engagement the verified content gets, and the cross tells you how much engagement the fake news actually gets. And unfortunately, in the majority of cases, even proper verification doesn't stop the spread of disinformation. And basically, only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times where Teyit.org gets things right. These are very easily debunkable, silly claims. When disinformation becomes more difficult to debunk, when there are nuances, it becomes much harder to fact check. But we did basically our own impact research, and we looked at the municipal election period on Turkey. You can read more about this. Essentially, I'm not going to go into the details on that. But basically, we tested about 10 cases individually to see whether debunking works or doesn't work. And essentially, we discovered that what ends up happening is that if the type of disinformation that these institutions are debunking is extremely silly, very easy to debunk, then it gets debunked and becomes fact-checked quite fast. But when there's a claim that is much more difficult to verify. For example, this individual political candidate was involved in a corruption case 30 years ago. Like, there's no way to actually find the data to actually support that claim. That disinformation type becomes very, very popular. And basically, the question that I'm headed from this point onwards, probably the third case study, is that under which conditions does fact-checking work? Because here we focus on about 10 cases, and doing disinformation impact research is extremely labor intensive, and because you deal with enormous amounts of data. I think the next place to go after here would be looking at, for example, the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, domestic issues, different foreign policy issues, and basically prepare a report that focuses on perhaps 30 of the most politically important cases Turkey has witnessed in the last 5 years, and actually retrospectively look at how much fact-checking actually ended up fixing disinformation cases, or whether disinformation is an unwinnable war, essentially, because everyone complains about it, but then everyone does it. So essentially, this is the results that we found in the report. What does that tell us about Turkish disinformation ecosystem? Recently, when I basically listened to interviews on TV or leadership statements, or statements from all parties, everyone is fatigued by disinformation. Everyone complains about disinformation. Nobody says that, oh, I do disinformation because it works for me. Everyone is sick and tired of disinformation, but then nobody knows how to get out of this conundrum as well. So it's a very interesting setting in which people hate disinformation, but the system continuously produces cases in which all sides continue to do disinformation. So in international relations, we basically call it the security dilemma. You buy 100 tanks, your neighbor buys 120 tanks, you buy 130, the other one buys 120. So it basically creates an unending spiral of insecurity. And I think it applies very directly to this disinformation issue. You continue to do disinformation because your rival continues to do disinformation, and you don't back down because the other side doesn't back down, in a way. So there needs to be either a public consensus, a social contract, if you will, that will basically ban disinformation or practice of disinformation. But of course, it's going to take time. It's going to happen when really everyone gets frustrated and fatigued with disinformation, that they stop using disinformation as a political tactic. So I basically look at this from a more evolutionary perspective. And even though fact checkers are great and do excellent work, I think it's very difficult for them to actually, do large-scale fact-checking on a truly national level. So thank you so much for having me and letting me, do this presentation. I'm going to stop here. You're muted.
That's great. Thank you very much for warning me. Thank you very much for this great presentation, Akın. I'm quite sure we will have quite a few questions for you. And now we will continue with Afşin Yurdakul. Quite a few of you just who live in Turkey, I'm quite sure you already know Afşin very well. I mean, she's a journalist and an anchor. She works for the Haberturk news network. Haberturk is one of the just national TV channels in Turkey. She has been producing and presenting TV shows, programs on contemporary affairs, and she was the foreign news editor of the network. But she's got amazing academic credentials on top of all these things. She has completed her master's on journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism, and after that, she was the first Robert Long, I'm sorry. It was the first Robert Long Fellow at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Afşin has authored one of the reports, has actually authored the report that has covered the findings of the previous reports, a meta report, as it were, and she has very kindly accepted to share her findings with us. Afşin, you got the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, CSOX. Thank you, Edam, and thank you everyone who is here at 7:30 p.m. Turkish time, 4:30 p.m. GMT time to listen to such depressing issues and learn more about those depressing issues in Turkey and elsewhere. So my work is my paper is part of a series prepared by Edam and supported by the Crest Foundation that looks at disinformation and polarization and the interplay between the two. So in a sense, my work builds on the previous Edam research, but it also allows me to bring in my perspective as a practicing journalist, because I try to combine the academic research that hopes to shed light on these issues with my everyday practical experience in the newsroom. As I'm sure Turkey or disinformation scholars who are tuning in today do know, that despite the fact that Turkey is a very polarized country and suffers from disinformation greatly, there isn't much research that's being done about that. So the Edam research is actually one of the early examples, in fact, I think the first one that provides such a detailed look at these issues, such as how and why polarization exists and affects the country's information environment. So I will hopefully provide you some background on the political atmosphere in the country and in what ways it affects the information environment, which I broadly define as not just traditional media outlets, print broadcast, but also the social media, the digital space, the social media platforms that we use, the spaces in which we exchange information in this country. So that's the broad definition that I will adopt for the sake of this presentation. I think there are Turkey scholars and disinformation scholars in the audience, but I tried not to assume much background on either of these while I was trying to put together my presentation. I will hopefully focus on the causes of polarization in Turkey, how an already fragile information environment ecosystem allows falsities, conspiracies, and disinformation to circulate, and what consequences it actually has for the society. So it's no secret that Turkey is one of the most divided and polarized countries, and its signs are quite visible to the naked eye, from rants on Twitter to fistfights in the parliament and attacks between politicians, which happens on a daily basis. There are various reasons why divisions are so deep, just to mention a few of them briefly. Number one, the constant electioneering mode in the country. Since the early 2000s, Turks went to the poll more than a dozen times. So constantly people are on the edge. That's the mood in the political mood of the country. The transition to the presidential system happened quite hastily as well. And 2016 is a critical year because of the traumatic coup attempt that in the aftermath of which Turkey, again, didn't really manage to foster a sense of unity, and it led to a very tense environment in the country as well. So most recently, the pandemic, I think, is yet another challenge to address in terms of how the outbreak, the coronavirus pandemic, actually added more strain to an already tense political atmosphere in Turkey. So coupled with a weak information environment, polarization makes falsities circulate easier in the digital space. And before I move on to the examples, real life examples and consequences of that, I think it's also important to note why I'm talking about a weak information environment in Turkey. Again, there are a couple of reasons that explain why. For instance, in recent years, shrinking press freedoms is one reason why it's just hard to be a journalist in the country. And media outlets and newsrooms have been focusing more on navigating a difficult political terrain as opposed to focusing on their jobs, which is reporting and writing stories and getting the facts out, or what fact checkers mostly do today. Akın outlined how they work in Turkey, or just make sure accurate facts are out. This is critical to foster a fact-based debate in the country, and I think we're already seeing alarming consequences of that in terms of Turkey's information environment. The rise of social media platforms is another reason why I think it's an incredibly complex information environment now. It happened at a dizzying pace. We really didn't have time to absorb and adapt to that challenge. So social media became very hyped very suddenly, and the speed with which information travels, it also changed because of the rise of social media and digital technology. So it's much harder now to fact check and make sure accurate information is out because it circulates very fast. Keeping in mind that internet and social media penetration rates in the country are 74% and 64% respectively, that gives you an idea about the scale that I'm addressing at the moment. And there are also structural problems in Turkish media which need to be addressed because they exacerbate the situation. It has a lot to do with the rise of digitalization and how it challenged and changed the old business models, and falling ad revenues caused print outlets to fold, some newsrooms shut down, and newsrooms lost experienced reporters and editors who know the craft of journalism so well, and who were perhaps the fighters at the front lines when it comes to fighting against disinformation. But because of all these complex trends that are interacting with each other, and the problems with the structural issues in Turkish media, that also adds another layer to why the information environment in this country is weak. Revenue issues also meant that clickbait became more popular. Sensationalist headlines were more important because to get ratings, to get clicks, people prefer that more. So when you add deep levels of polarization to this, we're faced with a situation where A, people don't really trust the media, and B, citizens mostly trust media outlets that they think confirms their worldview, that agrees or endorses or condones what their political ideas are. And we see this a lot in terms of people's choice of media outlets and their social media use. I'm going to give you a few examples. In my work, in my paper, I used data from Center for American Progress, which is a US-based, Washington-based think tank. In Turkey, only about 30% of Turkish citizens say they find media honest and truthful. Distrust is high among opposition parties when it comes to mainstream media. And Oxford Reuters Journalism Institute, these numbers are from them, 85% of the population uses online news and social media to get information. However, television still carries the weight. It's still the most popular news source that people turn to. It's about 68% that turn to television to get their news. Opposition turns to online outlets more, whereas government supporters tend to choose traditional outlets more, which shouldn't make you think that social media is entirely this free space where you can breathe. It's also a fragmented place that I will address briefly. It was in one of the add-on papers for the disinformation series that scholar Barış Kırdemir worked on, which was an attack on Turkish forces in Syria's Idlib province in late February. This was a huge shock to the entire country. The regime attack, the Russian-backed regime attack. However, when Barış Kırdemir tracked how this was talked about in the digital space, what emerged was almost perfect echo chambers, meaning that pro-government users were only talking amongst themselves about the Idlib attack, and those critical of the government were also only talking about the attack amongst themselves. This was a moment of national crisis. Still, you got these echo chambers and the news sources they turned to get information about the Idlib attack was also what they thought was telling the truth as opposed to the others, meaning they turned to the news outlets that they thought was in line with their worldview. So I think in terms of echo chambers in Turkey and the Turkish digital news environment, that was an important example to keep in mind. Real life consequences of how polarization and disinformation interact and sort of play out in the Turkish environment. I focused on the coronavirus outbreak and the situation with Syrian refugees as two examples that stand out in terms of how false information has real life consequences that decision makers need to take into account. Obviously, Turkey wasn't the only country where crazy conspiracies such as 5G technologies being behind the outbreak, or conspiracies of different sorts, the fact that virus was manufactured, all those were entertained in Turkish media space as well. And there were even stories about, put a peeled onion in the room so that you can stay away from the virus, kind of crazy information. So those were also the types of disinformation circulating in Turkey. It's just a great example to remind you that you need accurate information to make sure you can manage a health crisis, a public health crisis at the national level and also at the international level. Very briefly on Syrian refugees. As I'm sure those who are listening to us know, that Turkey is host to the largest refugee community in the world. Official numbers 3.6 million Syrians who live in Turkey, and public sentiment against refugees is increasingly turning sour because there is no end in sight for the war in Syria. They won't be returning, it seems like. Last summer, there was an incident in a working class neighborhood of Istanbul where a group that organized on WhatsApp based on some rumors of sexual assault, staged these attacks on Syrian shops, and police forces had to intervene. So I would like to underline WhatsApp there, because WhatsApp is one of the most popular messaging applications in Turkey, and it's encrypted, so it's much harder to track false information that circulates on WhatsApp. And I think in the long run, given that refugees are likely to stay in Turkey and how they often become targets of disinformation campaigns, decision makers need to really watch that and make sure that that's not a risk for Turkey in the future. Lastly, a few thoughts on why the relationship between polarization and disinformation will become increasingly important in Turkey in the next few years to come. It's because of the 2023 elections in the country. And I talk more about that in the paper if you're interested. But it's a high-stake election that will be held on the centennial of the Republic. And a weak and polarized information environment makes the country vulnerable. So this is something that needs to be addressed. It makes the country vulnerable to outside manipulation campaigns. And it's all the more important before we go to the polls in 2023, because we talked especially about Russia's role in such attempts with the Brexit vote, with the 2016 US elections. So that's something to keep in mind. I talk more about that in the paper, but if anyone's interested in maybe when we get questions, we can go more into that. And I borrowed a lot from Akın's work. So he really wrote a fantastic paper on Russian disinformation in Turkey. So that for me was also very helpful. And secondly, the very complex story about political ads in Turkey is going to be an important thing to watch as we go to the polls in to vote in 2023. Political ads aren't quite. It's a new topic here. Turkey is still getting used to thinking about it and sort of trying to understand what it is and what it isn't. But I thought it was an interesting thing to watch, because at least in one election cycle, which was before the municipal elections in Turkey last year, that there were some dubious ads that circulated on YouTube, which sort of looked like sound bites and clips stitched together, but in a way, it seems like it's a smear campaign, but it's it's also not very obvious who is sponsoring it, why it's circulating, why it's using hashtags relevant to the candidate or the election itself. And I'm not talking about political ads that are transparently financed and endorsed by political parties in Turkey. So we need to watch for what kind of content circulates on YouTube, because that also is an obstacle ahead of us if we really care about having a transparent, democratic political environment in the country. So those are my thoughts. I will leave it here in case the audience has more questions in the later rounds, and maybe then we can also talk about how to address these problems. It's all from me now for the moment. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Afşin. Thank you very much, for this great presentation again. And now, we will have Ezgi Basaran as our discussant, our own very Ezgi Basaran, I should say. She was the coordinator of the program on contemporary Turkey, and she kindly yielded the task to me. Before that, she was the editor-in-chief of Radikal newspaper in Turkey. She was the youngest and first female editor-in-chief of such a newspaper in Turkey, and she has completed her MPhil in Modern Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford, and now she's pursuing her doctoral studies at Oxford, and her doctoral research focuses on the relationship between AKP and Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. And she has been focusing on information exchanges between those movements as well. And of course, as she's got just plenty of just personal experience in the media, I'm quite sure she will intermesh just her personal just views and personal experience together with her academic criticisms. Yes, Ezgi, you got the floor.
Thank you, Mehmet. And thank you for these great reports. I think they're perfectly designed and enlightened us on what has been happening in Turkey's digital realm. I will try only to humbly compliment to what has been put forth. I would like to make several points based on my own experience as a journalist. Academically, I'm not working on journalism, so it would be what I will tell you will be based on my 17 years of journalism, the last 5 of which was spent as the editor of a digital news outlet. So first, let's face it, journalism is in a crisis, not only in Turkey, but all around the world. As Akın's report highlights, and as Afşin already underscored, Turkish media landscape has never been ideal due to its ownership models, due to its government and self-censorship habits. However, the ad revenue business model that had sustained the business for like decades, and the implicit bargaining that us journalists and reporters, we managed to do both with our sources within the state apparatuses and the owner of the media outlet, caused considerable cracks through which the true stories can get in on the pages. So I acknowledge that it was certainly not ideal, but it was better than how it is today. So it was around my first quarter as the editor of Radikal's digital outlet, I realized that we as the editors and also the reporters as the newsroom of this digital outlet, we were not only battling against the government crackdown, which was intensified, as you all know, in and around 2010, we were also trying to figure out on how to increase the reach of our news reports to, to more people against the supranational giants like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, who changed their algorithm every 6 months according to their revenue model. So we had to rearrange the whole curation and everything in the newsroom according to these giants. So the revenue model lies at the heart of this problem, both for journalism, for polarization in social media. So first, the business model of journalistic practices has been in shambles since the beginning of the millennium. But I remember it was around 2005 that the print ad revenues started and had been in a steady decline since 2005. And we were trying to find models to compensate that, but the digital revenues can never, nowhere in the world compensated the loss. So, plus the social media outlets, which, as I try to elaborate, have become the main disseminators of our news reports, instead of our good old trucks that we load our print newspapers 3 in the morning and our lovely newspaper kiosk, we now heavily rely on their algorithm, the social media algorithm. So to put it crudely, their algorithm may be good for their business model. It is certainly bad for journalistic survival. So the journalism literature calls this social media's infrastructure as connectedness-oriented communication, which actually constructs a new layer between the news provider and the audience. And a darker picture was in Nick Sinerek's Platform Capitalism, which was published 3 years ago, I guess. Yeah, he claims that the interactions between knowledge, production, and financial structures buttress the ongoing inequalities that the interactions between these structures produce. Put it simply, there is not a level playing field between these social media platforms and news organizations, neither financially nor technologically. So we still have not, as journalists, have not found a sustainable model that could be applied to a broader landscape of news outlets around the world. For example, the Guardian model, which relies on readers' donations, or New York Times paywall, or FD subscription model would be all problematic at this stage in Turkey. The BBC model, which I very much like and endorse, would also be drastic in a country like Turkey today, which is led by an authoritarian regime where the rule of law has become a dire joke, as we all know. So hence, we are in a perpetual search for a sustainable system for the newsroom's survival. Newsrooms are vital, and this brings me to my second point on fact-checking agencies. I fully support, as financially as within my means, those agencies. However, there is an important aspect about this subject that should be underscored. First, as Akın's report mentions, there are government fact-checking agencies that act like propaganda machines, but call themselves fact-checking in their wording. So these are very opaque organizations. The one that Akın mentioned is actually founded in the aftermath of Gezi protests secretly. The people who now run these fact-checking agencies also controls, since 2013, bot accounts. It used to be around 600 around 2013. Now they have thousands that enhance government myths and fight perceived government enemies. So similar entities under the name of fact-checking have flourished in the last couple of years in Poland, Hungary, India, Syria, Russia, where illiberalism is flourishing. That is more than problematic. Secondly, we should not be misguided in any way that these fact-checking agencies can replace or even complement journalistic practices. On the contrary, if, for example, the idea that those fact-checking agencies are the go-to places for people to find the truth gets nestled in our daily practices, this would be detrimental to journalism. You can say, so what, damn with the journalism, everybody hates journalists anyway, and lawyers. We want data scientists, computer engineers, geolocation experts to tell me the facts. Well, if you're one of those people, you do not know what journalism is and how it contributes to our social fabric. Reducing the legitimacy of journalism is, I think, to only fact-checking is very dangerous. Reducing the legitimacy of journalism is very dangerous, especially for diversity, because let's sit back and think, what is journalism? Yes, journalists, especially, for example, my colleagues in Philippines call themselves lately truth crusaders. And yes, fact-checking is one of journalism's fundamental elements, but it's not the sole element. Journalism is about telling stories about peoples, places, temporal ideas, and lives. So stories based on facts make our lives meaningful for the readers. It is the stories that lingers with us about, for example, Syrian refugees, about other cultures, other epochs. In order to deliver true stories, we need a newsroom filter and a guidance. These are of utmost importance. Fact-checking agencies cannot recover the stories that a decent newsroom facilitates. However, as I said before, news and newsrooms are very, very expensive. And we could not yet invent a model or a zone where journalism can thrive in. This is the crux of the problem, I think. So solution can come from that. My final point would be on polarization. Undoubtedly, the social media's consumer management system, which I touched upon earlier, enhances, propagates polarization. However, let's not conflate the issues at hand. There is a correlation between the political polarization of societies and the emergence of the social media platforms. However, Google, Twitter, or Facebook are not the cause of the political and social phenomena that we're currently experiencing. The upheavals and the rise of illiberalism all around the world are the main causes of the polarization. We believed in Fukuyama and his predecessors, who claimed in the aftermath of the Cold War that democratization would be contagious and the end of history has been initiated. Well, the democratization paradigm failed, and failed in such a way that it is now hard to make sense of what is happening. So I just want to end with the former design ethicist Tristan Harris's way of putting it bluntly. He claimed that social media platforms propagate the worst in human nature. For example, the tribal us versus them rhetoric. This is very, very common, and this is how echo chambers actually facilitates. However, it is not these platforms that created the anti-intellectualism, anti-cosmopolitanism, anti-democracy, anti-diversity, anti-immigrants, anti-Black, anti-women. Russian measures may have influenced, as Akın's a previous report elaborated brilliantly. For example, a lot of political cleavages in Turkey also influenced Trump election and the Brexit results. However, Russians have not created the feelings of exiting the EU or the grievances that led to electing someone like Trump. Russians apparently gave it a last push. So if you think, as Afşin said, that television is still the main source of the news for 70–80% of the population in most of the countries, social media platforms are just part of the problem, a big one, but does not really explain the whole disinformation quagmire. I think it is important to define the problem to come up with a viable solution. I do not have the formula, unsurprisingly. The only thing I know is reviving journalism, investing in journalism, investing in traditional newsrooms, rather than compensating its failures via outsourcing bits and pieces or delegitimizing it, would certainly help bring back the good in human nature. Thank you.